and this week I will be narrating and discussing Knapps stages of relational development. And we will be going through all 10 stages of relationships. You can apply it to anything that happens in your day to day lives. And so we'll pick up in the same chapter. But when you log into Blackboard, you'll see that it is posted. And we will begin from the beginning, more specifically looking at Mark Knapp. Mark Knapp is a professor emeritus at UT Austin, and I studied a lot of his research in both undergrad and graduate school. And he has, for a long time, looked at and developed 10 stages of relational development, and how do our relationships that we have over time, how are they maintained, how are they function, and unfortunately, how do some of them dissolve at specific times. So there's 10 stages, and as you can look at the diagram in the upper right hand corner, and this is for educational purposes for our students for the winter 2020 semester due to not meeting on campus due to coronavirus. So let's take a look at Mark Knapp's stages of relational development. He has quickly 10 steps in terms of how we can look at how relationships are maintained, structured over the period of time. As you look on the far left side, we have coming together, which is initiating, experimenting, intensifying, integrating, and bonding. We then become at an equilibrium. We kind of stagger when we look at relational maintenance, and then unfortunately we start to come down. And this is where we start to differentiate, circumscribe, stagnate, avoid, and terminate. I'm going to kind of push a stretch on my personal take on this theory, if you will. I know a lot of you all may have your own respective examples, but I will, as we go through subsequent slides, I'll kind of break down based off of what Mark Knapp says about this theory and then Cove's approach. Okay, so first stage is initiation, as you can see right here, and you can see the gentleman and the woman in the bottom right hand corner. During this stage of a relationship, this is where individuals size each other up. This is where people try to present themselves very favorably. People often scan the other person and try to consider any previous knowledge you have made of them. So let's look, for example, you can apply these. Some people apply it to romantic relationships. Some of us apply it to workplace. You can be very creative with how you apply this, okay? More specifically, let's say, for example, you start a new job, okay? You're starting at Domino's Pizza. And so you start to size up the manager. You're scanning him or her. Do they have tattoos, earrings? Is their hair colored? Are they tall, skinny, heavy, or set? You typically present yourself favorably. As a former manager, I tell you what, everybody is a perfect person on the first day of the interview. I tell you what, everyone comes in so looking so good and so nice, and then all of a sudden they've been on the job for about 3 months and they are not who they presented themselves to be in stage one of the initiation. People start to scan the person. This is typically normal. You look the person up or down. You know, I just started a new job recently as well, and so I'm trying to consider any previous knowledge I may have had of the particular area where I'm working at, any of the people. We look for common ground, similarities, and differences. So the example I've also given is if a boy finds a girl attractive and wants to make conversation with him or her, he will introduce himself with a formal greeting. How are you? What is your name? Our second stage is experimenting. Essentially, this one I want you to start. Small talk is the hallmark of this stage. And you may look at things as you're experimenting in the relationship. I love the Spartans too. Oh my goodness, you like Gap as well. This is where you look for some type of common ground to as well. Children experiment with parents quite a bit. They test us. They test our resolve oftentimes, and so they experiment. The same thing can happen in your relationship where you're starting to date someone and you experiment with, how far is this relationship going to go? What can we do? What are the boundaries? And then this often happens on the job too as well, where you may say, oh, you know what? If I'm on late a little bit, I wonder what this will happen. And so you start to experiment in this stage, okay? When we look at intensifying, and again, Mark Knapp kind of looks at this as a romantic, but I'll be a deconstructionalist a little bit, and we'll break it down to how we can apply some of these same concepts elsewhere. But on the third stage, when we're looking at this couple on the bottom right-hand side, This is where we indicate that we would like to or we're open to more intimacy. Remember, intimacy is not always romantic. Oftentimes, when we think of intimacy, right, it's natural to think that it's romantic. But intimacy is more specifically getting closer with someone, okay? Typically, here, we wait for a signal of acceptance before we attempt more intimacy, right? So, we may get someone flowers for Valentine's Day. We would get someone a card for their birthday. And then we wait for them when it's our birthday to come around, and hopefully they reciprocate that to us. This can happen over a period of weeks, months, or even years. So a boy may ask a girl for a date. During their date, they talk about their lives and how the boy just got a job and his personal experience. And the girl also reveals about her parents, her previous experiences, etc. This happens at the job too as well. That new job that you start, you start to tell people more things about yourself. This is where the relationship starts to intensify. We have integrating here. And this one I want you to start. The next two slides or stages are pretty much exclusive to romantic relationships. But when we start to integrate, this is where two people's identities and personalities begin to merge. So they kind of are a two for one deal. A sense of interdependence develops, okay, meaning you start to rely on that boyfriend or girlfriend that you've moved in with, okay, or husband or wife. This is most evident in romantic relationships, and these are elements that appear in other relationship forms. So you may sign or send a holiday card or opening a joint bank account. This is where you start to integrate yourselves. My wife and I did this too as well. It's part of the process, if you will. And I know some of you all out there, you keep your own money. You got a stash in the backyard, behind the playscape, to the right, etc. But typically in these relationships, you start to integrate. So stage 5 is bonding. This is exclusively, and you can just write marriage. Essentially, bonding is marriage. This includes a public ritual that announces the formal commitment. These types of rituals include weddings, commitment ceremonies, and civil unions. Obviously, this stage is almost exclusively applicable to romantic couples. Yes, you can bond with your manager or whoever if you all end up getting married. Typically, we do see the emergence of persons marrying people who they work with. Obviously, you spend a lot of time at work, moreover than more often, if you will, than your own family. So, stage 6, differentiating. Now you're starting to see, and you can tell by the nonverbals on the right hand side, that we are coming down to a bad part of communication. When we look at, according to Mark Knapp, differentiating, this is where communication differences becomes a primary focus. When we differentiate, this is the reverse of integrating. And I want you to start this third bullet point. This is when we and our reverts back to I and my. So Cub's going to give you a good example how to figure out if a relationship is starting to go sour. So you started dating and you all get married and you buy a house. You buy a house in a very nice area and you have a dog and you buy a TV. And the wording that you all use a lot because you're super excited, everything is great. You say, we just bought a house in West Bloomfield. This is our dog Fluffy. This is our big screen TV. Fast forward 5 years, 2.5 kids, maybe three. Can't really have half a kid, but 3 kids. You've got a couple dogs. Careers sour, not doing too well. Rocky relationship. We may be at a certain point in our life where we're approaching 50 or 60 and things are changing with us. So now all of a sudden, you may start to check your wording and it may say, oh, these are my kids. This is my dog Fluffy. I'm here to tell you that if you start to notice the language in your communication switching from we and our, which is very inclusive and it's warm and it's embracing, to now I and my, which is self-centered, doesn't mean that it's bad. This can start to signal that a relationship is starting to go down. I can't tell you how oftentimes I hear people say, oh, these are my kids or my children. I challenge you to start incorporating we and our. One of the best student papers I had, she talked about how her and her kid's dad, got divorced after I think about 20 years, and she always included and said, "Hey, these are our kids," etc., because they share that bond. That's a very, very hard thing to do, and I don't want to be getting emotional with what's happened in the past. That's none of my business. But if you start to use I and my, that's putting the focus on you, and it's not being inclusive. Okay. And people may try to reboundary some of their life prior to the integrating of the current relationship, including other relationships or possessions. Okay, so this is where people may isolate themselves. If you will, you used to share the car, or you could drive any car, but now you're taking the Tahoe more often than not. So our last couple stages that we have circumscribing. Essentially, at this stage, this is where your communication in your relationship is decreasing. Certain areas or subjects become restricted, and individuals verbally close themselves off from each other. They may say things like, I don't want to talk about that anymore, or you mind your business, and I will mind mine. Essentially, if you notice in your relationship, whether it's at work, um, or in your romantic relationship, if the communication starts to go down, you're at the circumscribing stage, okay? You used to talk about finances, and all of a sudden, you can't talk about them, okay? Stage 8, stagnation. This one I want you to really start. A lot of us are stagnant with a lot of things in our life. We may be stagnant with our job. We may be stagnant with our weight loss. We may be stagnant in that relationship we're in. We should have been out of it 4 years ago, but we keep her or him around, or that person, or whatever you want to call them, and we keep them around. But I ask you why? Why do you keep them around? At this stage, according to Mark Knapp, relationships may come to a standstill. Individuals essentially just basically wait for the relationship to end. You're just sitting around. Well, y'all got a mortgage together. Y'all sharing rent. It's 8 months till the lease runs out. So you just gonna do you. Outward communication may be avoided, and internal communication may be frequent. So outward communication, you just stop talking to that person, but internally, oh my God, why am I in this relationship? Oh my gosh, why don't I quit this job? Why? Well, I had a former manager. She she'd been quitting Kroger for 10 years, 10 years literally, 10 years, and I run into her from time to time, and everything is always bad, 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 bad. So why are you still staying there? You're being stagnant. And I'm not encouraging someone to leave. That person's probably not going to leave, right? They have a mortgage to pay. Perhaps they have children. They have a husband. I get that, or a wife, So think about the things that you're stagnant in your life. And I encourage you to try to do the very, very best that you can to get out of that, okay? Um, the relational conflict flaw of mind reading takes place as a person's internal thoughts lead to them to avoid communication. So our last couple slides is avoiding. And you all, how many of you just raising your hands, and we do it kind of rhetorically, right? You send that person a voicemail, you see the text, you don't answer it, because, you just want to avoid them. When we start to avoid, this may be a way to end the awkwardness that comes with stagnation. People typically signal that they want to close down the lines of communication, and their communication can be very, very direct, such as, look, leave me alone. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I quit. Be quiet. You get the drift, right? Or indirect. I have to meet someone in a little while, so I can't talk long. Why do we avoid certain things? Some of you all avoid Facebook topics. You don't want to talk politics. You don't want to talk about controversial issues, and that's fine. That's totally fine. But why are you avoiding certain things in your life? Some of you all are keeping secrets out there, and you're avoiding certain topics. Why? Not me to answer that for you. That's up to you. And lastly, this week we'll conclude with, unfortunately, termination. And you don't see it here, but termination can be voluntary or involuntary. And I want you to be able to think about what would be an example of voluntary termination versus involuntary. We'll start with the negative involuntary termination. Involuntary termination essentially could be, having to move away for a new job. Death is an example. Circumstances that present themselves where it's involuntary. Voluntary is where you're like, hey, this is over. I'm quitting you. I'm quitting this job. I'm out. This can occur shortly after initiation, or it can be after 10 or 20-year relational history has been established. Unfortunately, you have persons out there that have been married for 60 years, and they decide after 60 years or 50 or 40 or 30, kids are grown, they decide to terminate the relationship, and it affects the children. But why do people, if you've been with someone that long, why do you do that? Well, there's a myriad of reasons why someone could, and that's not up to me to kind of go in and kind of dissect. But you terminate that job. Why do you leave that job? Most people leave their places of employment. It's really because of their boss, their immediate supervisors. So if you're a supervisor out there, I encourage you, especially during this perilous time, to really reach out to your employees and people that work for you, because in the back of someone's mind, there always could be thinking about quitting that relationship. Geographic separation or changing in values or personalities. You guys started dating when you were 18, but people's viewpoints change. I know as a parent, my viewpoint, I felt a certain way politically, and over the years, I've personally changed my viewpoints on certain things based off of things that have happened to some of my friends or things that I've seen on a first case basis. I've been very, very fortunate and blessed to have lived in 3 geographic parts of the United States, from living in the Midwest, Michigan, to living in the deep south of Alabama, and then translating that over to the East Coast in Long Island, New York. And I can tell you that all of those 3 different places are vastly different. And so they bring different changings of values, and personalities. And this involves some typical communicative elements. It may begin with a summary message that recaps the relationship. So you may say something to the effect of, hey, we've had some ups and downs over our 3 years together, but I'm ready to go to college, and I either want to be with someone who's willing to support me, or I want to be free to explore who I am. So that brings to our conclusion Mark Knapps, Stages of Relational Development. I hope that you guys did enjoy this chapter. It was my job to bring this to you, and hopefully you can apply this to your everyday life. And it's my hope that you did definitely learn something today. So all the best.